this lesson, we're going to look at ES6 and classes in ES6. Now, when you write React components, you can use ES6 if you're using Babel or Webpack to transpile your JavaScript. Now, a lot of the code you will see online will be written with ES6 classes. However, everything we've written up to this lesson hasn't used ES6, so you're more than able to not use ES6 classes if you don't want to. I personally prefer to use them, and I know a lot of developers out there prefer to use ES6 classes as well. There are a few differences to ES6 classes compared to standard React classes, which we will explore now. Let's dive straight in and create our first component using ES6. With ES6, the first thing you need to do is define your class and the name of your class. You then extend the React.component. So you're extending the React library's component, and you're calling your class counter. So this is the equivalent of doing var counter equals react.createClass and passing in an object. There are a couple of minor differences, but you don't need to worry about those. They're essentially the same. As with all React components, we need to implement a render method. As we've seen before, when building React components without ES6, you have two options when implementing your render method. The preferred way, which we've used the entire way through, is like so. So you define the name of your function, a colon, and then the function itself. That's the preferred way and the way you'll see it in the React documentation. And you can also define the render method like so. You can define any methods like this in a React class. However, with ES6 classes, you cannot use this method. You have to define your render method or any other method in the new way. Let's go ahead and implement our render method. So this might take a little bit of getting used to. Don't worry, just keep going and you'll get used to it before long. Let's go ahead and simply return a div saying built with ES6 classes. Let's go ahead and delete our non-ES6 component. And that's all we need for a basic ES6 component. Obviously, as with all React components, we need to render it to the DOM. And we know how to do this now using React DOM and the render method. So the display name comes after the class in an ES6 component, which is pretty obvious. And of course, we are going to render it to the DOM using getElementById and pass in the ID of app. Let's go ahead and check this out in the browser. And there we go. We see built with ES6 classes. This is a very, very basic ES6 class component. It's not too complicated. You might take a few components to get used to it, but don't worry, you'll get used to it and it will become your preferred way of doing things. As mentioned, you don't have to use ES6 if you don't want to, but you will find that the majority of projects online do use ES6. One key difference when writing classes with ES6 is how you use default props. Let's go ahead and delete the text in our div and replace it with this .props.text. The same way you access your props when not using ES6 components, you access it with ES6. So no difference there. And we can pass in our props in the same way, like so. So if you save this, refresh your browser, you'll get hello, which is exactly what you'd expect. However, if you don't pass in any properties on your component, you want to have your default properties. When not using ES6, we of course use getDefaultProps. And we simply return an object, which is our default props. So it would simply return text of hello. One thing to quickly note is that when using ES6 classes, you don't need to separate methods with a comma. Save this, head on back over to the browser and refresh, and you'll find we get no text. If you open up your developer tools, you'll find you've got a warning. GetDefaultProps was defined on counter, a plain JavaScript class. This is only supported for classes created using React.createClass. Use a static property to define default props instead. Now all this means is that you cannot define your default properties within your components. So go ahead and delete them. The way you define default properties on a component when using ES6 classes is to get that component and then access the default props on that component. Notice it's a lowercase d for default and an uppercase P for props. And then you simply assign the default props for that component an object, which takes your default properties. It's that simple. So if you go ahead and save this, head on back to your browser, refresh, you'll see the warning's gone and you'll see our text is there. And this is our default props because we're not passing in any props to our component. You also define prop types in exactly the same way as you do with default props. Let's go ahead and do that now. So our counter and the prop types property on that counter, and we simply assign an object that contains our requirements. So text, let's go ahead and make it prop types dot number, so we get a warning. Notice it's a capital P and a capital T when you're defining what specific prop type you need, but a lowercase p and an uppercase T when you define it on your component, just to make things a bit more confusing. I know, it's annoying. Don't worry, you'll get used to it. Save that, refresh your browser, and you'll see we've got a failed prop type. Invalid prop type, text of type string, which is what we expect. So of course, if we replace it with string, because our text is a string, refresh, and refresh the browser, the warning has gone away. State is also dealt with slightly differently in ES6 components. Whereas before, you would simply get your initial state, like so, and return the state object. So let's do count of 0. This is going to throw an error for us. Get initial state was defined on counter. Unlike default props, you don't define your properties outside of the component. So we don't do counter dot initial state. We don't do that. Instead, we have to use a constructor. So within our component, we define our constructor function. Now within our constructor function, we have to call a function called super. I'll come back to that in a bit. To define our initial state in an ES6 component, we simply use this.state and then assign our initial state, like so. If we go ahead and delete our getInitialState, save our component, refresh the browser, you'll see our error has disappeared. And actually, if we go ahead and console.log this.state, save it, refresh, we'll see we get our initial state. The super function gives us access to the keyword this in ES6 components. If you go ahead and comment it out, save your component, and then refresh, you'll see you get a syntax error that this is not allowed before super. So if you don't call super within the constructor, you do not have access to the keyword this. And in fact, if you console.log this from within our render method, refresh the browser, you'll see that this is not allowed before super. So you must call the super function if you want to have access to this. Now, as we've seen, you don't need to use a constructor, and if you can't think of a reason to use one, i.e. you don't need some state, don't use one. Only use one when you have to. Now, if I go ahead and console.log this after our super call in the constructor, we will see exactly what the keyword this represents in our constructor. And it represents our counter. But you'll also notice that our props are undefined. So if we go ahead and console.log this.props, we get undefined. In ES6, to access our properties within a constructor, we need to pass in the props and then pass them in to the super call. And this will give us access to this.props. So if you save that and refresh, we now have our props, which we've accessed through this.props. Now in our constructor, because we're passing in props, we don't actually need to access them on this.props. So we can access them just using the keyword props. And there we go, get the same result. So when should you pass props to the super function? The answer to that is that if you're using a constructor, you should always pass super the props, as it reduces confusion and makes things a lot clearer. It doesn't affect performance or anything, so it's purely for clarity. Otherwise, you might run into an issue because you haven't passed super the props. One thing to note is that if you do not use a constructor, you do still have access to the keyword this within the render method. So if you console.log this within the render method and then refresh, you still see the component is logged to the console. When you don't use the constructor, because the keyword this is still available, you can still use events. So we can create an on-click event, so this.click for example, and then let's go ahead and define our click function. And I'm simply going to alert that the div has been clicked. So this will work because we have access to the keyword this, and there we go. That's because we haven't used a constructor. So if we uncomment this and then comment out our super call, save that, refresh, we of course get an error because a derived constructor must call super. So that's one thing to note. The chances are that you will want to use a constructor in a lot of your components. Obviously, as mentioned before, you want to try and use stateless functional components and make your components as simple as possible, but we'll get onto that a bit more in the next few videos. I mentioned earlier on that when you use ES6 classes, the keyword this behaves slightly differently. Now, when you use React.create class, React automatically binds the keyword this to the correct value for us, and we've seen this before when making our other components. But with React and ES6 classes, the keyword this can get a little bit confusing. If you go ahead and comment out the alert and your constructor, and then inside your click function, put console.log this, save it, head onto the browser, refresh, and then click the hello, you'll find that we get null back. And that is because in an ES6 class, you need to bind the keyword this to the function you want to call this from. Now, there are a few ways you can do this. You can either do it where you call the function. So on the onClick event, you can do .bind this, save that, refresh, click, and you'll see that we get the component. But the most common way, and perhaps the best practice, is to do it within your constructor. Within your constructor, you just need to do this .click, so we're accessing the click function, and just say equals this .click .bind to this. Because the keyword this is available in our constructor and it represents the component as we've seen, if you assign this .click, so this function here, to equal this .click .bind to the component, within the click function, the keyword this represents the component. So it represents what you expect and what you want it to represent. If you save that, refresh your browser, click, and you'll see you get the component you expect. You can actually use some ES6 to bind the keyword this correctly within the event call. If you go ahead and replace this .click with some brackets and equals, and then an angle bracket, you can call this .click. All this is ES6 to create a function. So rather than writing function blah blah blah, you write brackets, you can pass in any parameters you want, and then the function you want to call. And this will create a new function for you which has this bound correctly. If you save this, refresh your browser, you will see that when we click hello, we get the correct this. We get the correct component logged out. Another useful thing about using these arrow functions is that you can actually pass a value in to the call. So if we pass the value 10, and then within our click function itself, pass in a value, we can console.log the value. Save and refresh. Click the div, and we get 10, which is great because we can't do this unless we bind within the function itself. So unless we do this .click .bind this and then pass in 10, that's the only other way we can pass the value in with the correct this. So when you bind within the constructor, you can't pass the value in on the call directly unless you use the ES6 arrow functions. You can bind either on the event call itself with this .function name .bind and then passing in this and any values you want, or you can use the ES6 arrow function as we've seen, where you simply pass in the function you want to call and then any values you want to call in that function. And you can also pass in some props there if you like. Or you can call it from within the constructor. The best practice is to call it from within the constructor unless you need to pass a value in which case use the Es6 arrow function. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.